Let's go ahead and get started. It's time for the panel. We're very happy to have this panel on industrial policy in developing countries, and to have a very distinguished set of speakers: Doug Irwin from Dartmouth, Beata Jaworczyk, and Danny Roderick. We're going to just have them, rather than what we were just doing during the previous talks. We're going to have 15 minutes of uninterrupted time. You can take less than that, each speaker, but not more. So 15 minutes of uninterrupted time, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end, moderated by me. Again, if you when the Q&A time comes, you should raise your hand. I will then say your name, and I think Leslie has to promote you to panelist, and then you can ask your question. And also feel free to write questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat. Let's do it in the Q&A box, and then that will allow me, if we have too many questions, I may have to pick and choose, and so I'll use the questions that are written on Q&A as a basis for choosing who gets to ask their questions. Okay, so without further ado, let's have so Doug Irwin. So the subtitle of the talk of the panel is Historical Perspective and New Thinking. So we'll have Doug especially going to provide some historical perspective here to get us started. Okay, Doug, please take it away.
Great, it's a pleasure to be here. I am going to talk about a historical topic, which always raises the question: why should we care about history? What are we going to learn from this? And I want to trace sort of the intellectual rise and fall of import substitution. Now, there's no way I can justify understanding why history is important. So I turned to my friend, Billy Idle. So he's going to say something about this.
I think a lot of people want to know where the roots of music have come from. Where did what's happening today come from? Where did the ideas of today, even the technology that's working today, where did it come from? How did it begin? What got us here? I think people always want to know that, and they always want to know what the triggers were, what the mechanisms were, what the thing that pushed the wheel of life forward, the wheel of history, the wheel of musical history forward, and kept it going to where we're still excited, we're still dancing and going out of our minds to great music somewhere. And if we're not, we're thinking about how to make that happen.
All right, so I think what he's trying to say there is that we're interested in how did we get here? How did things evolve in the past? What was moving the wheel of history forward? And so I want to go back and look at the idea of import substitution and talk about how it sort of rose and fall as a development idea. So first of all, this is just a picture of a Google Ngram of references to import substitution. Whoops, I went too far there, and I think it may be blocked here. But what's interesting is so this is books, so it's not exactly what we're interested in terms of the academic literature. You know, it starts around 1960 or so, and then peaks around 1990. But actually, if you look at academic interest, it really takes off in the 50s. And I'd say by 1970, interest was waning. So books are sort of a lagging indicator. What we can see here is there has been a bit of a resurgence in interest in import substitution, and that's a bit of what I want to go into. So I will really want to explain this here. Why is there this sort of this rise and this fall? Interestingly, The Economist, which just came out today, asked this very question: why is the idea of import substitution being revived? So, you know, I wrote this paper a couple months ago. Thought it would be purely of antiquarian interest, but somehow it is still of interest today. So basically what I do in the paper is I just go back and read the old great development economists of the 50s and see what did they say about import substitution. Did they think it was a good idea, bad idea? You know, my impression was, before I'd done this, is that everyone was sort of uniformly in favor of import substitution. There'd be very few dissenters. So I'll tell you what I found out, which came as a bit of a surprise to me. So the one person who I focus quite a bit on is Raul Prebisch. Of course, famous for these policy positions, famous for writing what was called the Manifesto on Economic Development in Latin America. He advanced the idea of a secular decline in the terms of trade and a whole bunch of ideas that sort of permeated literature in the 1960s and 70s. And he's often considered to be sort of the key advocate or proponent of import substitution. So what did he have to say about things? So first of all, why would you want to pursue that policy? Well, this is the era of the dollar shortage. So it wasn't just Latin America and other developing regions, it was Western Europe. There was a shortage of dollars. And so there's this thought that you need to save foreign exchange. So developing countries, foreign exchange was very precious, very scarce. And so what you had to do is you had to have import controls because you had to get rid of these non-essential consumer goods. It would be waste. If you're just buying frivolous things, you don't want to do that. You really want to save your foreign exchange for capital goods because that will promote industrialization. And so that's sort of the major rationale. Now, there was a commodity boom in the early 50s because of the Korean War and other things. The dollar shortage gradually sort of faded away. And so the rationale that Prebisch offers begins to change throughout the 50s. So here he talks about a reasonable measure of protections indispensable for industrialization. And by the end of the decade, he said he's looking at disparities in foreign trade elasticities, and only sort of obliquely referring to industrialization. So his sort of rationale changes a bit over the 1950s. When we look at some of the other big thinkers of this period, a lot of them shared similar views, although there were some dissents. Gunnar Myrdal is very interesting. He also accepts this idea that you have to ration foreign exchange because it's scarce. And if you ration it, what you want to do then is allocate it to good growth promoting imports, keeping out frivolous, wasteful consumer goods. He was not an export pessimist. He believed that exports were important because importing capital goods was really quite necessary. What shocked me about reading Gunnar Myrdal is he's very down on free trade. He's very down on prices and market allocation. But he was also very down on quantitative controls on imports. He just really focuses on the idea that they don't work well in advanced countries, and they're not going to work well in developing countries. It leads to corruption and inefficiency. But despite going on for a number of paragraphs against quantitative restrictions, he says, well, ultimately, they're really necessary. Now, Prebisch then in the 60s, and Myrdal a little bit, and I'll come to the others in a moment, begin to change the thrust of their comments. So as early as 1959, Prebisch is noting indiscriminate and massive protection has gone too far or beyond the optimum point to the serious detriment of exports and world trade. 61, he says, import substitution has been carried out with very serious flaws. In the mid-1960s, he's worried about creating watertight compartments that's created vested interests that oppose trade and don't take into account the serious effects on economic development. So Prebisch really is beginning to change his views by the early 1960s. And this is reflected in some research that his associates did at the Economic Commission in Latin America. So there's this famous paper, 1964, published by ECLA, or SIEPR, depending on how you think about it. And it's basically talking about in Latin America, how there's excessive and indiscriminate protection, basically geared to import substitution at any cost. There's a lack of rationality, and it's redounded to the detriment of their economic development. So even ECLA is critical of the trade policies being pursued by Latin American countries in the mid-1960s. Now, the others, I thought there was sort of this consensus. I didn't find much of a consensus. So Ragnar Nurksa, he was actually opposed to import substitution. W. Arthur Lewis is very interesting. He's not an export pessimist, but he's very vague on trade policy. He focuses on a lot of other prerequisites to development, not as much trade policy as I would have thought. Albert Hirschman is always very interesting, and in the late 50s, in his famous book on the strategy for economic development, he's sort of a contrarian. He talks about imports help industrialization and restrictions, he says, are self-defeating. He actually changes his views a little bit later in the 60s, once again being the contrarian. As everyone's moving against import substitution, he's beginning to think it's more favorable. So what was striking to me is just how much disenchantment there was, even among the initial proponents of import substitution, by the mid-1960s. And it's interesting, the sort of list that they identified. So they talked about excessive protection leading to inefficient domestic manufacturing. They said, well, it really doesn't save on foreign exchange. A lot of the import substitution industries are very dependent on imported intermediate goods or capital goods. And so that raises the demand for foreign exchange. It harms non-traditional exports and reduces export earnings. And like Myrdal pointed out, there's important political economy points that were being raised in even the 60s about licensing regimes in particular being corrupt and inefficient. What is also striking to me is that you might think if you got all these problems, and even Prebisch is identifying them, well, there should be calls for reforming developing country trade policy. Instead, Prebisch constantly put the burden on the advanced or industrial countries to open up their markets to the developing world rather than developing countries reforming themselves. So that's sort of this decline in the 1960s. And of course, the point was really put forward by a number of other economists coming up, a new generation, Ian Little, Jagdish Bhagwati, Bela Balassa, and Ann Krieger. And what's interesting is where they got their views. They weren't sort of steeped in the development literature of the 50s so much. Balassa and Krieger are interesting because Balassa basically never supported import substitution. And that's because he grew up in Hungary and didn't like the economic policies of the communist regime there. Krieger, as far as I could tell, was never an export pessimist, but really didn't start focusing on import substitution and its costs until she went to Turkey on a USAID mission in the mid-1960s. So they were never really, they didn't start out against, in favor of import substitution, but the evidence sort of took them in a certain direction. What's interesting about Ian Little and Jagdish Bhagwati is they were both fairly strong proponents of import substitution in the late 50s and early 1960s. And for both of them, it was their experience in India that began to change them. So after Bhagwati came back from Cambridge and Oxford, he started talking to his friends in the Commerce Ministry and elsewhere, asking, how do you allocate import licenses, or what's the economic rationality here? And it sort of went against what he had learned in Cambridge. And so he gradually became disenchanted in the early 1960s. Ian Little was a very strong proponent of import substitution, but he went to India on a mission in 1965 and looked at the projects that were being created there, and it completely turned him in a different way. And of course, there was a lot of other growing empirical work in development journals on Pakistan and Chile, in particular, on empirical evidence on whether these policies were working. So by 1970, Ian Little writes this book, Industry and Trade in Some Developing Countries, that sort of identifies some of the costs of protection. Bhagwati and Desai wrote India Planning for Industrialization, which talks about import licensing and things of that sort. Bela Balassa looks at the structure of protection in developing countries and talks about the high and highly variable effective rates of protection. And so both the original proponents of import substitution and this new generation sort of had soured on the idea, certainly by 1970, if not by the mid-1960s. So my takeaway, and it was a surprise to me, is that the proponents of an import substitution, the original proponents, were never really strong advocates. They were surprisingly cautious, very measured in what they were saying. They were very aware of the shortcomings. And they anticipated most of the critiques of the later economists. They were not sort of sheltered and had a Panglossian view of import substitution. They're very well aware of the problems. Is just a matter of emphasis in terms of where they came down. And what was sort of key to changing minds was country evidence, seeing how the policies were actually working out in practice. It wasn't really any new theoretical developments or things of that sort. And just to sort of conclude, because this is relevant for this panel, is these critiques and this debate in the 1960s, it's not directly related to infant industries. It's not directly related to industrial promotion policies. Is really focused on the cost of import controls. So they weren't ruling out necessarily industrial policies, but they were saying that certain types of policies aimed at clamping down on imports could be counterproductive in many ways. So that's just a brief survey of the history, and that's sort of what I discovered by looking back at some old books and articles.
Great, thanks very much, Doug. You're right on time. Perfect. So let's go to Beata. Beata, you're watching. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Eric. So let me share your screen. It's always, Doug is a tough act to follow. No short movies on my side. But anyway, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel and part of this discussion. I'm not a huge fan of industrial policy. So the message of my talk is going to be very simple. And it is, let me just click to make sure it works, that if you must do industrial policy, do investment promotion. And I am not going to explain why attracting FDI inflows may be a good thing. I think most of the audience is quite familiar with that. We can leave it for later. Instead, I'm going to focus on investment promotion itself, on the policy itself. And I will try to convince you that if you must do industrial policy, do investment promotion, because FDI promotion is cheap, it's effective, and it doesn't introduce distortions. Moreover, it can be used to upgrade exports, and it can be used as a tool of shaping comparative advantage. And finally, I also argue that it can be used to stimulate innovation. Now, UNCTAD says that 4/5 of these developed countries have an investment promotion agency. Of course, the question is, do they work well? The World Bank used to do an assessment, benchmarking of investment promotion agencies, and very often it discovered that these agencies had no functioning websites or never bothered to actually reply to queries. So it's not just about having an agency, it's about having an agency that works. Now, what is investment promotion? Investment promotion has 4 main objectives, according to Louis Wells. And the first one is image building. It's telling the world that my country is a good place to do business, particularly doing some type of business. It's about contacting for prospective investors and trying to convince them to come in. So in other words, it's about lowering information barriers. It's about helping committed investors to actually set up operations. And it's about being an intermediary between investors and the government, so engaging in policy advocacy in order to make setting up of a business or expansion of business easier. So in other words, it's all about lowering the fixed cost of entry. Now, you may ask, what about fiscal incentives and other incentives? I would say no, let's not do that. Simple reason is that it's very easy to overpay. And the claims I'm going to make are based on the definitions of investment promotion as serving these 4 functions. And the results I have obtained in my research show that actually having fiscal incentives on top of the primary function does not lead to more FDI. So how do we know whether investment promotion actually works? Well, in my previous life, when I was at the World Bank in 2005, I was leading census of investment promotion agencies, and we obtained detailed information from 110 countries, 81 of which have an investment promotion agencies. And at that time, we identified further 31 countries which did not have a national agency. And because I had a team, we could collect very detailed information about sectors that were considered priority by these agencies in their efforts to engage in their efforts to attract FDI. Of course, not all of them were using sector targeting, even though sector targeting at that time, and presumably now, it's considered to be best practice. Basically, the idea being, instead of telling investors, my country is a wonderful place to do business, it's more effective if you tell them my country is the best place to do business in this and in this industry because of X, Y, and Z. And if you reach out to foreign investors, you should be trying to reach out to firms that may find your country interesting because your country has these these are the sectors on which you're focusing. So what that means is that if you have information on priority sectors by country engaging in investment promotion, if you know when they started being priority sector, when they stopped, you can do a diff-in-diff approach and ask, is it the case that sectors that where investment promotion agencies tell us they are focusing their efforts, are these sectors really getting more FDI? The sectors, the information on sectors which are targeted by this agency was collected in a systematic manner. So there was a particular classification of sectors. And as you can see, countries vary in terms of choice of sectors and in terms of which sectors they were targeting at which point in time. So if you ask, is investment promotion doing what it's supposed to do? Is it resulting in more inflows of FDI? The answer is yes, but it's yes only in the context of developing countries. And that actually makes sense, because in advanced countries, it's fairly easy to obtain the information you need, and the barriers to setting up business, the cost of setting business, is much higher. So the analysis shows that priority sectors get more FDI than other sectors, and this effect is particularly pronounced in the case of countries where information asymmetries are greater. So for instance, in countries where fewer people speak English, or in countries where navigating through the bureaucratic maze is more costly, meaning countries where there are more procedures to set up business. You can also ask, is it the case that exports originating from those priority sectors see an increase in unit values over time? So is there some upgrading of exports going on in those sectors that are targeted by investment promotion agencies? And indeed, the answer again is affirmative. So my conclusion is that investment promotion can help countries upgrade their export structure. Investment promotion is cheap. If you believe the analysis, targeted sectors get more than twice as much FDI relative to non-targeted sectors. Now, the IPI census showed that an average agency spent about $90,000 per sector targeted. So we are talking here about agencies in developing countries where things are cheaper. So if you were to do a back of the envelope calculation, it would tell you, $1 spent on investment promotion, that's $189 on FDI inflows. If you wanted to express this in terms of affiliate employment, targeted sectors on average were created 1,000 more jobs. So that's $78 per job creation. Of course, you should be taking these figures with a giant pinch of salt, but nevertheless. Now, what about using investment promotion to shape comparative advantage? And that actually could work through two channels. First, foreign investors are often huge exporters. Think about Volkswagen in Slovakia. When Volkswagen was reorganizing their production lines, you could see it in the national statistics of country. Caroline Freund and Denise Pierola looked at export discoveries, and what they found is that export discoveries are often due to entry of multinationals. So it's actually a multinational that is starting to export a product that's new to the export structure of that country. Of course, there are also indirect effects. Local firms may learn about export opportunities from foreign affiliates. They may copy what they do. There's a literature on productivity spillovers and so forth. Now, Caroline Freund and Ted Moran looked at a set of case studies in various parts of the world, and they concluded that the objective of generating exports, in particular exports in novel sectors, is more likely to come about by overcoming market failures and other obstacles that hinder multinational investment than by promoting domestic entrepreneurship. So if you believe the story, you should see that sectors that are considered priority by investment promotion agencies see an increase in their exports. So in other words, you can relate exports volume, value of exports of a product P in country T, in country C at time T, to whether or not this product belongs to a sector that's a priority sector for the national agency in that country. You can control for product country fixed effect to capture underlying comparative advantage in that country, or to underlying conditions to relate it, for instance, to geographic advantage. You can control for what's happening in international markets by having product year fixed effect. You can control for national policies with country year fixed effect. And when you do this, you see that there is a relationship between sectors being considered priority by investment promotion agencies and volume of exports or revealed comparative advantage of products belonging to those targeted sectors. Now, you may say, well, it's all about reverse causality, right? These agencies want to show that they are doing something right, so they will pick sectors where we expect to see a lot of exports in the future. Well, that doesn't seem to be the case. In the census, we ask them, how do you measure your success? For most agencies, it's the amount of flows, it's the number of jobs created, or it's satisfaction of customers with their services. Actually, only 1% of agencies said that exports were an outcome that was measured. And if you do an event study, basically ask, when relative to the sector becoming targeted, you see an impact on the volume of exports, you see that there is no impact prior, and actually the impact happens 2 years after a sector becomes a priority sector. So there is actually quite a bit of a delay. Now, you may still not be satisfied, and you may say, well, what is actually driving the choice of priority sector in that country in that year? Right, so to control for that, we can use the following trick. We can actually ask, is it the case that we see a bigger impact on exports of products with some characteristics? So for instance, products that are more capital intensive or products that require relationships specific impact. Inputs. So in other words, what we can do is we can interact our policy variable with a product-specific variable, and that will allow us to control for sector, country, year unobservables. So anything that may be driving the choice of sector S in that country at that time relative to other sectors. And when you do it, you still see a relationship between volume of exports of product belonging to the priority sector, and this relationship is particularly strong where you would expect it to be strong, in capital intensive or in products that require relationship specific inputs. So what about innovation? You could repeat the same exercise, but now you could ask, you could look at number of patent applications or patents granted. So here we use patent families, which basically avoids double counting of patents. And you see again at T+2, so 2 years after a sector becomes a priority sector, you see an increase in patent applications. And you don't see anything happening in the run-up to that sector being patented. Being chosen as a priority sector. You could again use the same trick by interacting the policy variable with characteristics of industries belonging to this more aggregated sector, and that again allows you to control for country, sector, year fixed effect, and you see the same message. You see that targeting a particular sector is associated with increased patent applications or patent grants, and this is particularly true in R&D intensive industries. And if you are thinking that these are only patents that are that have been created somewhere else but are now only being applied for, that doesn't quite seem to be the case, because these are patents involving at least one domestic inventor. So these are patents that were co-created in the country in question. So to conclude, investment promotion is cheap, it works, and if you get it wrong, nothing bad happens. You've just wasted a bit of money running the agency. I think it can be used as a tool to shape patterns of comparative advantage, to upgrade exports, and to stimulate domestic innovation. So thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Beata. Again, congrats. Thank you very much for staying on the schedule. So let's go straight to Danny Roderick. Danny, take it away.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks for organizing this panel. And I think Doug's and Beata's comments have been very interesting. What I want to do is, in the very short time, just talk a little bit about ISI, largely for the kind of light it may hold to our present discussions. Then I want to say a little bit about the future of industrialization, which I think is very, very bleak, and therefore necessarily puts a kind of a necessary caveat on any use of industrial policy, since industrial policy is typically focused on manufacturing. And I want to end with a few comments about where I see sort of a new form of industrial policy now, with sort of industrial in quotation marks, that sort of has been developing, and what kind of conceptual approaches go with that. So let me start with imports substituting industrialization. And I want to start here with an apparent paradox, that the actual performance of the ISI countries, for not generally, but for a lot of them, was actually much better than the reputation ISI has today. So this is looking at the aggregate labor productivity growth in some of the key ISI countries, comparing them to two export-oriented industrializing countries, South Korea and Taiwan, for a period of a quarter century between 1950 and 1975. And what's rather striking is how well, in fact, some of these countries did. Brazil, Mexico, Peru, all exceeded annual average labor productivity growth rates of about 3%. In fact, Turkey did much better over this period, very comparable to South Korea and Taiwan. Even Argentina, which is always an example of a failure, had labor productivity rates higher than 2%. Really, among sort of the major Latin American countries, really perhaps Chile is the one that really does the worst. So the overall labor productivity performance of ISI countries in this early period was not that bad at all. And in fact, this performance looks much better if we compare them to their subsequent performance. So there's after 1990, most of these countries had moved to very different configuration of policies, opening up to trade, removing quantitative allocation of foreign exchange, opening up to free capital flows, and so forth. And if we compare labor productivity in the most recent quarter century, since 1990, what's really striking is how bad their performance has actually been in the more recent period. And look at Brazil, look at Mexico, which is really an amazing example of a country where labor productivity growth simply collapsed despite very large increases in international trade and foreign investment associated with NAFTA and so forth. Really, of all these countries, the only one that does, on the whole, better is Chile, but all the others essentially have done much worse. So what actually happened? I don't want to go into the details of what the analysts of ISI got right and wrong. Perhaps we can talk about that later on. But the interesting question is, why did these countries, under policies that we would normally consider to be highly indiscriminately inefficient in ways that Doug described, why is that these countries actually ended up then doing even worse after they opened up their economies and dismantled these policies? A lot of that has to do with what has happened to the patterns of structural change And here I'm focusing on Latin America, although the pattern is quite similar in a lot of the other ISI countries as well. In the early period, again, looking at the first quarter century between 1950 and 1975, a very large part of the labor productivity growth that these countries experienced came from intersectoral reallocation. Industrialization wasn't all of it, but clearly it was a very important part of it. That is, moving labor from lower productivity activities to higher productivity urban activities. Manufacturing was one big part of it, but also a lot of associated urban services as well. And if you compare the pattern of labor productivity growth after 1990, really the big change is that it is the between component, the structural component that has collapsed. That structural change in these economies went from being very significant contributor to labor productivity growth to actually, on balance, a sort of growth reducing feature in labor productivity growth. Some of it is due to the process of deindustrialization, which I'm going to be talking about, but also sort of in general inability to support employment in the more productive areas, the growth of informality and so forth. So that's, I think, in an accounting kind of a sense, sort of, scratching the surface of this productivity collapse. A lot of this is that for all of its ills, the ISI was able to do something, which was to move labor out of very low productive agriculture to somewhat more productive manufacturing, even though many of these manufacturing firms may not have been globally competitive. Labor productivity was still higher than in the next best alternative. And that process essentially just stopped bringing back labor productivity growth overall. Now, this happens during a time when also there are factors that are really quite extraneous to the policies of the developing countries that have to do with technological change, intensification of globalization overall. That means that there is a general and from the standpoint of developing countries themselves, a premature phenomenon of deindustrialization that's happening. So these are just some, essentially just graphing some, the estimated values of some decade dummies. And they're showing exactly, it's a measure of how much employment is disappearing out of manufacturing. So if we just run these regressions on sort of predicting manufacturing employment, that for every decade, the actual level of manufacturing employment has fallen such that by the 2000s, compared to the 1950s, we have a deficit of about 12 percentage points of the total labor force in manufacturing. Very large reduction in overall manufacturing employment by the 2000s. With respect to the countries with strong comparative advantage in manufacturing, there is also a significant decline in employment, even though it's not as large as in the case of other countries. So there is not only a significant process of deindustrialization that's going on regardless of country policies, it's also that where this deindustrialization is concentrated in is particularly in terms of employment of low-skilled labor. So for a subsample of these countries and for a somewhat shorter period of time, we can disaggregate the employment losses into these three skill categories: low skill, intermediate skill, and high skill. And what this chart shows is essentially that all the deficit in employment in manufacturing, all the employment deindustrialization is really taking place in low skill employment. And that's important because it's an indicator that what's really driving this is a process of much more skill and capital-intensive technologies in manufacturing that's reducing demand for low-skill labor, and that's a global phenomenon. It's happening in the developing countries as much as it is in the advanced countries. In fact, if we look in a more detailed fashion to the modes of production or production techniques or capital intensity more specifically in developing countries, in some of the poorest developing countries today, what we're seeing is that we have in manufacturing patterns of skill and patterns of capital intensity that is way out of line with respect to what the factor endowments of these countries is. So this is from work that's sort of ongoing with some co-authors, where we're looking at the firm level manufacturing data in Tanzania and Ethiopia. And we take as our baseline just to compare to the Czech Republic, a country that's sort of much richer and obviously much more capital and skill abundant than these two countries. In fact, Tanzania and Ethiopia are roughly sort of around 5% of the Czech Republic's per capita GDP or economy-wide capital to labor endowments. Now, when we look at sort of these very, these countries that are, very abundant in low-skilled labor, we would expect manufacturing to be able to absorb a lot of this low-skilled labor, and that sort of traditionally was the mechanism through which industrialization promoted structural change and labor productivity growth overall. But today, that is less and less so that in manufacturing in our two countries, in these two labor-abundant African countries, the capital intensity in manufacturing is somewhere between 5 and 6 times more than the economy-wide capital labor endowment when we take the Czech Republic as our baseline. So it becomes manufacturing is an extremely capital-intensive part of the economy. Even more strikingly, perhaps, if we look at the largest firms in these two economies, the largest 10% of the firms in manufacturing, which roughly produce between a fifth to a quarter of total value added in manufacturing in our two economies. Essentially, then we get that the capital intensity of these firms becomes quite comparable to the capital intensity of manufacturing in the Czech Republic, again, a country that's so much more capital abundant and skill abundant. So this is, I think, part of the reason why today countries like Ethiopia, even though they have been experienced some degree of success in exports, in manufacturing, are not able to generate the kind of economy-wide growth that the earlier set of countries did. It's simply because manufacturing is no longer acting like this growth escalator. It's unable to absorb the resource which developing countries, low-income developing countries in particular, have the greatest abundance in. I think where that leaves us is that regardless of what you think about ISI, it's clear that the kind of industrial policy or policies directed towards structural change and productive development will have to take a very, very different form than what they have in the past. And I think, here, because I know I'm not, I'll have to stop soon, and I can't go through all the details of this. I describe essentially what are some of the elements of some more contemporary approaches to this and how they differ from the traditional type of industrial policy that have worked well in the past. So I think the traditional type of industrial policy used to focus on manufacturing, especially on export-oriented manufacturing in East Asia. I think today that's unlikely to yield dividends for the reasons that I've talked about briefly. So I think increasingly this kind of policy, which now I think is better to call productive development policy rather than industrial policy per se, I think has to focus on domestic services, non-traditional agriculture, in addition to manufacturing, because manufacturing on its own is not going to be a source of labor absorption. I think also the kind of, the top-down type of industrial policy that we associate with with East Asia, obviously is very inappropriate. So we need to adjust the practice of industrial policy to settings where we incorporate the idea that government agencies don't actually have a lot of information about where the market failures are, but perhaps they can build capacity to learn where they are. So it's much more of a collaborative, iterative process of learning that's very different from the East Asian model. And there are a number of countries that are experimenting with this type of productive policies. And I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A, but I should not exceed the time that I was allotted, so I'm just going to stop here.
I've never had such a disciplined panel. Never moderated such a disciplined panel. But let me, so thanks very much for all three contributions. Let me just start opening it up. If you want to, so raise your hands. I should be able to, I should be able to see hands going up, or if you're if you're a panelist already, you can just jump in. I also have questions which I'll jump in with if I don't get people jumping in instead. Okay, let me start it off, and hopefully people become less shy. Let me go. I guess one question is with Danny. So when you're talking about labor absorption, I guess I started thinking about this. There's old debate about appropriate technology. The technology should be, but there's a tension there in the sense that the more advanced technologies are typically developed in rich countries, and where the factor availability is different. But so I wonder whether if we focus, insist on an appropriate technology, we're actually a country would be dooming itself to being on a low, sort of behind the curve technologically in the world. And so whether that would actually be is that what you're advocating, or is that something to be avoided?
So I think thinking about this in terms of the old appropriate technology literature is exactly right, and I think it's weird, and that was probably a lot less relevant at the time when E.F. Schumacher was writing "Small is Beautiful" and things like that. Probably that argument wasn't very relevant then, but I think honestly, generally now it is relevant because we have a set of technologies that are being developed in response to relative factor prices in the North, where capital is cheap and labor is expensive. And they are now essentially being disseminated globally to a much greater extent, because if you want to be part of a global value chain, you have to produce pretty much using the same production technique. So your flexibility in terms of changing your production technique is very limited. So in the old days, it would be that a lot of manufacturing would use very labor-intensive techniques because you had a captive domestic consumer base. I remember when I was growing up in Turkey, there were all these shoddy toys that the local firms were producing, and I had to buy them because you couldn't buy anything from abroad. But that now completely disappears. And now sort of, Ian Little and Ann Kruger can claim success because we've gotten rid of all those inefficient domestic, low quality, low productivity toy companies. But it turns out that on average, the productivity of labor there was much higher than where it is in traditional agriculture or in informality. So that we're still aggregate labor productivity wise, we're ending up worse off. Now, what the normative implications of this is, I'm not quite sure, but it does leave developing countries in a very, difficult situation.
Okay, I see a question from Juan Carlos Halak. Juan Carlos, if you can, or Leslie, if you can unmute Juan Carlos and then let him ask his question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you for a great panel. This is a question for Danny. Danny, I would like to take it from where you ended your talk. You mentioned that the new industrial policies, you need interactions between the public sector and the private sector. So I wanted to ask you, in the case of Latin America, what are the most notable experiences that you have seen that of a successful public-private interaction, and what were the institutional arrangement to help this happen?
Thank you, Juan Carlos. So let me give you two examples. One would be a relatively more recent example in Peru under not the current administration, but the previous one, although I think the current administration is trying to adapt it, is where the Minister of Industry, Piero Ghezzi, set up essentially what it was called the sectoral roundtables. And essentially, it was, the setting was one where he basically said, look, I'm not here to give you trade protection. I'm not here to give you subsidies. I understand that there are a lot of reasons why productive development might be hampered due to either things that I'm doing as a government or lack of coordination or the absence of public inputs that are important for productive upgrading. So let's engage in collective learning about sort of where the problems are and what is it that I can do. And I think there were a number of successes interesting, not that much in manufacturing, but much more in sort of in non-traditional agricultural exports. Another example would be actually, again, somewhat surprisingly, would be the example of Argentina, which we don't associate with a successful industrial policy, but Argentina has actually had in agriculture, again, in non-traditional agriculture, has had a long experience with this National Agricultural Technological Institute and FONTAR, which interact on a continuous basis with agricultural producers and agricultural producer groupings to introduce new varieties, to generate new technologies, to engage in development of common standards. And it's that kind of sort of open-ended, collaborative, iterative process of learning that does not take from, sort of from a presumption that we know what the problem is from the outset, that we need to subsidize inputs or that we need to provide export subsidies. But it's a process of learning where sort of how these enterprises overcome productive challenges. So I think under the radar screen, there are a lot of sort of, detailed, small scale examples of this. And sometimes, sort of what we know a lot less about is where they work and where they didn't work. And because of the nature of this also, it's hard to undertake rigorous evaluation of these things. And so I think that's the part where I think, we have less knowledge of.
Perfect.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thanks. So Claudio Fejas has a question, I think.
Hi, hello, great panel, super interesting. I had a question which is a little bit related to Juan Carlos, but maybe relating to other topics. One is politics, which is the political economy of these things. Like if we go back in history and how it was implemented, especially in Latin America and many other countries, it was not under democratic regimes. And then we have to put in the table and see how those things will interact with politics and special interests. And the other thing that I think people don't talk about is the importance of competition, right? Like how, especially in many developing countries, if we have this type of agencies and we have interactions public sector and private sector, because we have very large firms, both in manufacturing services or especially in agriculture as well, very large producers, like JBS in Brazil, for example, is a very key example on the billions that he got from the development bank, for example, right? So those subsidies or credit, whatever, gets very concentrated, right? So I don't see kind of the competition in the market being discussed in this issue. So I'm just wondering what you think about it. I think it goes also in the Beata discussion on how do you foster innovation and investments.
Great, thanks. Maybe, I don't know if Doug or Beata, do you want to jump in so we're not always, yeah.
I'm happy to jump in, though I will probably take an angle that you were not quite asking about. Let's think about the current situation, right? We have deep economic crisis in many parts of the world. In many countries, firms are in trouble and are going to be in more trouble because of the second and possible third wave of COVID. So governments will be injecting equity, they will, or maybe outright nationalizing firms. And, you know, in rich countries, this is going to stimulate a debate about, you know, are taxpayers getting the right reward or not? But in countries where governance is poor, this may be quite a troubling development, because the minute you have state ownership, you may have jobs that are being given to friends. You may create a vested interest that will prevent nationalization. And if you look at many countries where the EBRD operates, for instance, in many cases, line ministries that run state-owned enterprises are also regulators of the sector. In, I think, 10th of the countries where we operate, only 1/10, there are regulations that prevent state-owned enterprises from getting unfair advantage over, so getting advantage, I shouldn't say unfair, getting advantage over private sector. So for instance, that would prevent soft budget constraint, subsidized inputs, preferential tax treatment. So what I worry about is that going forward, the playing field may be tilted against private firms and in favor of state-owned firms.
Doug, or let me ask Doug first, or Danny, do you want to also follow up?
And let me just say one word about politics in response to Claudio's, I think, valid concern. And I think this always has been a kind of argument against industrial policy, that once you start engaging firms, that that you can be taken for a ride by the firms, and they're always sort of insiders with vested interests in certain types of policies. I think that's entirely valid concern. The only thing I want to say is that this is not a concern that is that's special to industrial policy. I cannot think of any domain of policy where government does not operate under asymmetric information, facing a group of insiders with very strong vested interests, which are the two strong arguments against industrial policy: that the government doesn't have enough information, and that it can be gamed by strong political interests. Think about monetary policy, think about sort of education policy, think about social policy, health policy. Each one of these areas are areas where the same two features operate. The debate we usually have in those areas is not whether we should have education policy, or whether we should have monetary policy, or whether the government should have a fiscal policy. The debate is always, okay, subject to those risks, how do we actually design policies and institutions that are more robust to those threats? And I think that's also, I think, the kind of concern that the kind of more modern or contemporary approach to industrial policy that I've described tries to respond to by making this process open-ended, making it transparent, making it open to newcomers and outsiders, and not being just sort of working with incumbents and so forth. And as Claudia said, being democracy in some sense also forces you to do that. But the risks are clearly there.
Okay, there's a question also from Adrian Wood. Adrian, if you're there, go ahead.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks all three panelists. Really good presentations. A phrase that hasn't been used at all is infant industry. I mean, it's something that is pervasive, but nobody's mentioned it. And I raise this simply because I suppose my question is the idea of infant industries dead? And in particular, has it been replaced by the idea of infant firms? Because you think we're now in a kind of Mellitz type world in terms of both theory and data, where all the emphasis is on differences in performance among firms within sectors. So shouldn't we be focusing on, as it were, trying to promote the performance of particular firms? But then that takes you back into this unhappy territory of national champions. I don't know, I suppose in a way my question is to Beata. I mean, I absolutely agree with her about the efficacy of FDI promotion, but do we only have to rely on foreign firms? Is there nothing we can do to, as it were, that's equally cheap, simple, and effective to promote the productivity of some domestic firms, not necessarily selected ones?
I think, Adrian, you asked two questions, right? So on infant firms, venture capital, right? I mean, that's in a sense, but you know, we leave it to private sector, but now IFIs are stepping into this. And in a sense, you know, one of the things EBRD is doing, we are trying to promote development of capital markets and creation of, among other things, you know, venture capital funds. So in that sense, we are going towards promoting infant firms, just not directly through public sector actions. On, you know, why FDI and why not any other way? My answer is that multinationals are producers of knowledge and innovation, right? You know, they are responsible for 3/4 of business R&D globally. So it's just very hard to match, you know, the amount of knowledge they have. So it's just simply a cheap way of bringing knowledge to your country.
I see hands. I see that there was Marcella Slava and Richard Newfarmer and Dan Treffler. So Marcella, if you can, please jump in and ask a question.
Hi, thank you. Thanks very much to all. It's a great panel. It's a question that I think is for all panelists. I was starting from Dan's point on the rapid deindustrialization of Latin America, perhaps non-industrialization of Latin America, which implied not a return to agriculture, but like a very rapid transition to services. I see the current picture as one where though all of those huge resources put into services are characterized by lots of informality, tiny firms, some also self-employment. So the low productivity is not only a tilt of the distribution to the left, but mainly a much thicker left tail of those tiny firms. So I'm trying to put that picture that I have in mind together with these recommendations by Beata, say, of policies oriented towards FDI attraction, or Dan's recommendations regarding public-private collaboration with an emphasis on services, which sound reasonable with the transformation that would be needed to transform all of those resources, low-skilled labor trapped in those tiny firms and self-employment, especially in services, especially in retail. And I'm not seeing how those two sides come together. So I just wanted to get your reactions in terms of thinking of a massive transformation of that very large fraction of the Latin American resources trapped in those sectors and types of firms.
I'm not sure who that was for. Maybe Doug, since you haven't had a chance to speak here in the discussion, if you want to jump in. Otherwise, I'll let Doug, do you, or I'll let
I'll let the others handle it.
Okay. Now, I mean, I'm less pessimistic than Danny about manufacturing. So manufacturing is not dead, right? And what the world has discovered during the crisis is how incredibly dependent we are on China. And I think going forward, there is a recognition that we will be seeing more shocks, that we need to make global value chains more resilient. And that often means China plus one sourcing strategy, right? So I think that many countries, many emerging markets stand to gain from that. So, it's not, I'm not implying that, tomorrow half of US multinationals will close their facilities in China. What I'm saying is that next time they are making a decision where to locate production, they are going to take resilience into account. And I think this is a chance for Latin America to increase its market share in the US. Right? And, FDI can help facilitate that. So if you are a country that's already exporting a lot of a given product, then you could expand. If you are not exporting a given product, then entry of FDI could help you start production and exports of that particular good. So I am less pessimistic, and I don't see such a sort of bleak future where nobody will be manufacturing anything other than China and robots.
I think on manufacturing, it matters greatly whether you're looking at on output or employment. So we know, for example, that at constant prices in the United States, the share of manufacturing value added in GDP is roughly stayed constant. So if you look at, even in a rich country, you don't have deindustrialization at constant prices, but it's where you see it is in terms of a very dramatic reduction in employment. Now that's particularly harmful for developing countries because that's where they have their comparative advantage. So these technological trends are what essentially, to put it differently, is what they're doing is they're completely undermining the comparative advantage that developing countries have in the one resource that they have in abundance, which is low-skilled labor. Yes, you can, every country now is talking about localization, industry, import substitution is back because countries are hoping to get manufacturing back, so you have, reshoring, going on. That is simply not going to, have an effect on employment. That's sort of my concern. And if it's not showing up in employment, then effectively manufacturing becomes no different than just like a kind of an enclave industry. It's like, a natural resource or a mine that operates very productively at relatively capital and skill intensive, but doesn't have the ability to essentially, generate growth. And I think that's essentially more and more what manufacturing is starting to look like. It's not there yet, but I think it's the employment consequences are the ones that I'm really concerned about. So that's where I think Marcela's question really comes, and it's a question that really haunts me, and I don't have a good answer. When you have a situation where in the urban areas, all the employment is concentrated in these very low scale, very low productive, very small, informal, petty services, how are you able to, undertake a kind of productive transformation that's going to, create employment opportunities for these for these workers in more productive areas. In the old days, manufacturing did that through industrialization, and I don't think that's really going to happen. So that's really the central conundrum of development in my mind, is that question. Now, I think the kinds of strategies that Berta talked about can be helpful, because if you think about these foreign firms coming in, not just operating on their own, but having an ability to create a kind of local suppliers, produce a kind of a local productive ecosystem of suppliers. Now that you can see how that can begin to also have significant impacts on domestic employment and so forth. But we need to be able to do that at scale. It's not going to be just through foreign investors, I think, and FDI. You also have to work with your large firms domestically that view themselves as much more integrated with the global economy than with their domestic economy, and find ways that you can prevail on them to actually sort of integrate backwards, share knowledge with their potential local suppliers, and generate these kinds of backward linkages with the local economy, which is not happening.
Great. We just have about 3 minutes, and we have a talk happening just right after this. But I wanted to let to first Richard Newfarmer and then Dan Treffler. Maybe what we can do is just make your comments or questions in sequence before going back to the panel, and then if we have some time, then we'll have the panel give the last word. Thanks, Richard. If you're there, please go first, and then Dan.
Yeah, fabulous. I have a question actually for each panelist. The first is for Doug. I wondered if you wanted to take a look at that graph that Danny Roderick threw up, and if you would sort of agree with the rather sanguine interpretation of that graph. I do want this on labor productivity. I do wonder if we might think about the high productivity rates in the 1950-75 period as being related to the later low productivity rates that we saw later on. In other words, where substitution period cast a rather long shadow on labor productivity in Latin America. And I think that the counter case of Chile, which abandoned import substitution much sooner than the rest of the countries, may be in fact an indication of that. The question I have for Danny is, you wrote a wonderful article, one of my favorite articles that I always assign to my students, way back in 2004, called An Industrial Policy of the 21st Century, or some sort of variation of that topic. And you had 10 principles. I wondered, in light of kind of the new sectors that you're talking about, how you would modify those 10 principles. Are they still applicable in your point of view? And my question to Beata has to do with public investment. I'm struck working on Rwanda and Uganda, how important public investment has been as a promoter of rather specific activities. So in Rwanda, for example, they have made big bets through public investment to attract foreign investment in the convention center, for example, on the airline, in the airport, in underwriting hotel construction for the tourist industry. And up until the pandemic, it appeared to be paying big bucks, and quite a good return. 40%, 50% of export earnings were in tourism, an industry that was built really with public investment. The opposite has happened in Uganda, a much less successful investment in petroleum, where they've also tried to bring in foreign investment. How do you think about public investment as investment promotion, and what should we be wary of in thinking about that?
Eloquently stated a question that unfortunately we're not going to have time to answer. So thanks very much. So we're on a strict timeline, but let's give a round of applause for the panel. Thanks very much for your input. That's extremely stimulating.